All right, so here we're going to wrap up the central nervous system, and we'll talk about neural pathways or neuronal pathways. And these are mostly in the spinal cord. We talked about them in the brain earlier. So the major spinal tracts are part of a multi-neuron pathways, and there are 4 key points about spinal tracts and pathways. Decussation, we mentioned it before. That's a place where things cross over from one side to another. And most of these pathways cross from one side of the central nervous system to the other. And you can probably figure that out when you realize the brain is wired contralaterally. There are also relays. Relays are chains of at least 2 or 3 neurons. One passes a message to the other, a relay. Somatotopy is a spatial relationship in the central nervous system that corresponds to a spatial relationship in the body. So the brain, the central nervous system, knows where the signal is coming from because it's mapped to that part of the body. Remember, there's no difference in a neural signal, only the location it's generated from. In symmetry, the pathways are paired symmetrically, a left side and a right side. So in an ascending pathway, information is going up to the central nervous system, and it's going to have a chain of at least 3 neurons. The first order neuron is going to conduct impulses from cutaneous receptors and proprioceptors, and their locations are mapped. So when that signal comes from a particular place, the central nervous system knows where that is coming from. They branch diffusely as they enter the spinal cord or the medulla, depending on where they are, and they synapse with second order neurons. That second order neuron is almost by definition an interneuron. It's talking to the first order neuron, and it's going to pass the information to another neuron. So its cell body is in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord or within the medullary nuclei, and its axons are going to go up to the thalamus or the cerebellum. The third order neuron is also an interneuron. Its cell body is in the thalamus. Axons extend to the somatosensory cortex in the brain, and we do not send third order neurons to the cerebellum. Not that the information doesn't get there, it gets there by more roundabout pathways. Somatosensory signals travel along 3 main pathways on each side of the spinal cord. The 2 pathways that transmit somatosensory information to the sensory cortex through the thalamus include the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathways and the spinothalamic pathways. They provide for discriminatory touch and conscious proprioception. The third pathway, the spinocerebellar tract, terminates in the cerebellum. So that dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway transmits the input to somatosensory cortex so that we can discriminate touch and vibrations. It's composed of paired fasciculus cuneus and fasciculus gracilis in the spinal cord and the medial lemniscus in the brain, medulla to thymus. The spinothalamic pathways are lateral and ventral spinothalamic tracts. They transmit pain, temperature, coarse touch, pressure impulses, and they are within the lateral spinothalamic tract. The spinocerebellar tracts are ventral and dorsal tracts that convey information about muscle or tendon stretch, and they are talking to the cerebellum. That's the part of the brain that needs that information because it's going to coordinate muscle activity. So here are some of the ascending pathways, and I encourage you to check them out in your textbook. These are also ascending. So we have the dorsal pathway. This is fasciculus cuneus and fasciculus gracilis, or the dorsal white column. This tract is transmitting sensory impulses from general sensory receptors of the skin and receptors to give us an idea of pressure, touch, body sense. The lateral spinothalamic is transmitting impulses concerned with pain and temperature. It's contralateral, so on the opposite side of the brain for interpretation. The ventral spinothalamic transmits impulses concerned with touch and pressure, more crude than the other, to the opposite side of the brain again for interpretation by the somatosensory cortex. The dorsal spinocerebellar is involved in transmitting impulses from the trunk and lower limbs proprioceptors to give us a consciousness or subconsciousness to the cerebellum for making plans, while the ventral spinal cerebella transmits impulses from the trunk and the lower limb to the same side to the cerebellum for subconscious proprioception again. Descending pathways and tracks deliver efferent impulses from the brain to the spinal cord and out to the body in many cases. They are either direct or indirect pathways. The direct pathways use pyramidal tracks. The others are indirect. Motor pathways involve two neurons, an upper motor neuron, which the pyramidal cells in the primary motor cortex, and lower motor neurons, which would be the ventral horn motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscles. So the direct pyramidal pathways carry impulses from pyramidal neurons in the precentral gyri through the pyramidal tracts. They descend directly without synapsing until the axon reaches the end of the track in the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, its axons synapse with interneurons in the lateral tract or ventral horn motor neurons in the ventral tract, and they are going to be used to direct and regulate fast, fine, skilled movements. Indirect pathways are often referred to as multineuronal pathways. They are much more complex, multisynaptic, which was you should get from the term multineuronal. It includes the brainstem, motor nuclei, all the motor pathways except the pyramidal pathways, and these pathways are going to regulate axial muscles, helping us to maintain balance and posture. Muscles that control coarse limb movements are head, neck, eye movements that follow objects within a visual field. They have four major pathways: the reticulospinal and the vestibulospinal tracts, which maintain balance, varying tone for postural muscles. The rubrospinal tracts control flexor muscles, while the tectospinal tracts originate from the superior colliculi and mediate head movements in response to visual stimuli. Three descending pathways. So we lateral corticospinal, ventral corticospinal, tectospinal, vestibulospinal, rubrospinal, and reticulospinal. Here is a type of functional RNA, magnetic resonance image that reveals some of the fiber tracts in the brain connecting to the spinal cord. Developmentally, well, I know we've gone through a lot of development in the central nervous system, but starting at week 3-old embryo, the ectoderm is going to thicken. It's going to form a neural plate. That plate is going to fold, forming the neural groove we talked about, and neural folds. The neural crest is going to form. They begin the migration. The groove will deepen, giving us the neural tube that we started out this chapter talking about. And the process of rosterization will begin. So that brain will form on the rostral end, spinal cord on the caudal end. By 6 weeks, the have an alar plate and a basal plate. That alar plate become all the interneurons. The basal plate will become motor neurons, and neural crest cells will form the dorsal root ganglia by week 6. Gender-specific areas will appear in both the brain and spinal cord. That depends on the presence or absence of testosterone, fetal testosterone. Maternal exposure to many things can harm the developing central nervous system. And one of the issues with the central nervous system is that it does develop very soon. It's one of the earliest tissues we get. So it's important to avoid things that can damage the developing central nervous system. Alcohol, opioids, infections, rubella is a dangerous one, and smoking. Hypothalamus, though, is one of the last parts of the central nervous system to develop, which is one of the reasons premature infants have a hard time keeping their body temperature regulated and need to often remain within an incubator. The visual cortex develops slowly over the first 11 weeks. It takes a lot of training. When we talk about vision, we'll talk about that. The neuromuscular coordination is going to go superior to inferior and proximal to distal, and that has to do with myelination. Age does bring some cognitive designs, but it should not be significant. If a person is healthy up until their 80s, normal development is not going to cause deficits in cognitive ability. If you see that, then there is some sort of process going on, and it's possible that there are treatments for that. So don't be afraid to seek diagnosis when you see someone with cognitive declines. Our brains do shrink as we get older, and that accelerates. Excessive alcohol can lead to that, and if you happen to be a boxer, you probably ought to stop doing that. They can bring about senility unrelated to the aging process. Right, and that wraps up the central nervous system.